word of prayer, please. Pray with me. God of all, we just thank you for this time and opportunity that we have to gather as a community, to come and learn and share with one another so that when we leave here, we can inspire and teach others. Please grant your servant Peter strength, for he has to be weary. He has traveled many, many thousands of miles and many hours to be here with us. We're eager to hear the word that he has for us, so that when we leave here, we may love you and others more deeply. It's in your holy and precious name that we pray. Amen. I'd like to introduce Sarah Faulkner. Most of you know her, and she is also a member of our Y Board and our Spiritual Emphasis Committee, and she is going to give you some good words and insight into our speaker today. Thank you.
How fortunate we are today to have as our guest the Reverend Dr. Peter Story for the fourth and final Spiritual Emphasis Tuesday here at our YMCA, as Tracy was just telling you. Dr. Story is the guest preacher at the 55th Annual Finch Preaching Mission at Memorial Methodist Church, which concludes this evening at 7 o'clock p.m. service, and I would hope and all of you could come and invite you to do that. There is so much to say about Dr. Story, and I was looking on the website and reading through all the brochures. I could probably spend all the time we have today telling you about him, but I'll try to make this as brief because you want to hear every word that he has to say. He's truly made a difference in his country of South Africa and around the world. He is a South African Methodist minister who is a former president of the Methodist Church of South Africa. Dr. Story spent most of his pastoral ministry in the inner city churches in Cape Town and Johannesburg. He served as chaplain to Nelson Mandela and other political prisoners on Robben Island. He worked along with Bishop Desmond Tutu in dismantling apartheid and promoting peace initiatives in South Africa. After retiring as bishop, he taught for 7 years at Duke University Divinity School, where he was named a distinguished professor. He has received a number of honorary degrees, including one bestowed by him at Duke University in 2007. Dr. Story has preached and lectured widely around the world and is the author of several books. He was the founder of the Methodist monthly newspaper, Dimension, and was editor for 8 years. Yes, he does all of this and is married, he has time for that, to Elizabeth. They are parents of 4 sons. They also have 6 grandchildren. But his greatest credential is that he is a man of God. There are a few people who I believe have God's cell phone number and God has theirs, receiving texts from heaven on a regular basis. Dr. Story is one of them. You will hang on to every word he says today as he shares his message on healing the wounds of Africa. Thank you so much, Dr. Story, for being here.
Well, thank you very much. I don't know about you, but certainly with me, the cell phone reception is sometimes very poor. Yeah. What's my, give me my terminus ad quem. 12:50. 12:50. Okay, with some time to maybe have some questions and that. You're okay with that? Sure. Thank you. I'm very scared to show any flu symptoms coming from Africa. I want to talk to you this afternoon about healings from the wounds of Africa. I come from a wounded continent, a continent that has suffered perhaps disproportionately over the centuries, particularly as we look back at the assault that was represented by the institution of slavery on the continent of Africa, particularly West Africa, the parts of Africa that escaped the scourge of having their people stolen from them And where I come from in southern Africa, that was not such a big issue, but West Africa, which again is now assaulted with this terrible Ebola scourge. And then after slavery, there came colonialism, where the nations of Europe decided to carve Africa up and to take whatever pieces they could for themselves. And the way they went about that was so arbitrary that there are lines today running right through families and clans of the past. One side being in Malawi, perhaps, and the other side being in Zimbabwe, just because some people from Europe came along and drew a line and said, that's yours and that's going to be ours. And the injuries that have been caused by colonialism are very, very deep and profound. And it's as if that was not enough. Then came the Third World War. And you might sit up and say, the Third World War, did we have a Third World War? You did have a Third World War, but you didn't fight it in your own country. And the Russians didn't fight it in their country. They fought it in Africa. And every war in Africa for a number of years was really a proxy war being fought between the United States and the Russians through other people, with other people doing the dying. And so my country, for instance, and our racial troubles were all part of our white government was able to use this Third World War to get the support of your CIA, for instance, to support and prop them up, because they argued they were really fighting against communism. And so these ideological battles from the Northern Hemisphere played a big role in doing enormous damage in the continent of Africa. And perhaps it's summed up maybe by an interview that I saw once, somebody interviewing Desmond Tutu and saying to him, now, Archbishop Tutu, what do you think was the very worst thing about apartheid? And Desmond sort of sat for a moment, that he put his fingers here. And he said, the worst thing about apartheid is that it kept on telling me that I was not a person, that I was less than a person. And that became internalized inside us. And we began to believe it about ourselves. And somehow we've got to unlearn that lie about ourselves. So, yeah, and of course, you know, famine, flood, and the rest, you name it, Africa seems to collect it. But we're also a very resilient continent, and a continent which somehow seems out of its pain to have been able to offer the world some special gifts. The only country in the world that has 4 Nobel Peace Prize winners is my little country at the bottom end of Africa, South Africa. 4 Nobel Peace Prize winners. Somehow out of the conflict and the struggles of that country have come giants of the human spirit. Something else that has come out of the wounds of Africa is something that we call Ubuntu. Now, Ubuntu needs to be translated into English. It's a concept of, if you like, communalism, in which I recognize that I can only be a person through other persons. That's what Ubuntu is. That my personhood, if you like, the flowering of my dignity as a human being is intimately tied up with your dignity as a human being. And that if I take away your dignity, I lose mine. if I assault your humanity, I lose, my humanity becomes damaged as well. And frankly, you know, when the missionaries came to Africa, they came on the sort of on the wave of imperialism from Europe. In a way, the doors were opened to missionaries in Africa by the fact that the colonial powers were in charge of those places. And so it was very difficult for a missionary not to mix up the idea of the gospel they were bringing and Queen Victoria. You know what I'm saying? That not only were you bringing the gospel, we're bringing you a superior civilization from the great white queen across the ocean. And perhaps some of those early missionaries were slow to realize that some of the things they were preaching were already present in the culture of the people of Africa, including Ubuntu, because if you asked me to put Ubuntu into theological language, I would talk about agape. I would talk about this sense, this concept of love, which is a kind of unconditional positive regard for the other and seeking the best interests for the other, knowing that ultimately that also is in the best interests of all. And when we put that alongside the enormous emphasis on individualism in Western society, I believe there is a lesson from the wounds of Africa for the incredibly self-centered culture of the West, where kids are taught that the thing that matters is to get on and get to the top, and it doesn't really matter who you tramp on the way, because you've got to get to the top. It's a rat race. That's the picture of life which is often communicated to our children in Western society. I believe we need to discover a return to Ubuntu. Now, let me say that Ubuntu itself has been deeply wounded in my continent. And I wouldn't want to claim for a moment that everybody is living by that code, because it has been damaged as well there. I also believe that one of the truths of life is that somehow the people in the world who know best how to forgive are often the people who have been most deeply wounded. And therefore it was, I think, a surprise to the world when the institutionalized government-driven policies of racism in my country are called apartheid, when these things finally saw the writing on the wall and began to fall away. People were waiting for the revenge. People were waiting for acts of retribution. And I think people were pretty amazed when South Africa set out on a path of truth and reconciliation. Now, it wasn't an accident. The new Minister of Justice in our country, who was a lawyer, a wonderful man, a Muslim, who had suffered torture under the previous regime and had been in solitary confinement, he came to the churches and the faith communities, and he said, you know, we've got to somehow try and deal with all the crimes that were committed in the past. Now, he said, I'm a lawyer, and I deal in crime and punishment, and I'm just very sure that that's not going to cut it, that it's all too big to handle that way. We need something deeper and something more. And he said, you're the people who talk about things like forgiveness. You're the people who talk about things like confession. You the people who talk about things like repentance and reconciliation, those are words, he says, that don't really belong in my profession. You're the people who are supposed to know about that. Tell us how to do it. And so we had many gatherings and workshops and seminars and things like that as we struggled with how are we going to deal with this dreadful, dreadful past and the things that we have done to each other. And, you know, we had these options that have been used before. Obviously, one of the options is to prosecute and punish. Find the bad guys. Find the ex-presidents of the country and the politicians and hang them, whatever. But the question is, you know, who do you prosecute? Where do you stop? Do you just handle the top politicians? Do you go for the generals? What about the colonels? You know, what about the little men in grey suits who used to sit in government offices and with a stroke of their pen used to ruin somebody's life just because of the colour of their skin? What about them? Why should they escape? And in any case, how long do we want to do this? Do we go on forever chasing down the bad guys? Have we got the resources to do that? Have we got the energy to do that? Have we got the hate to do that? And the answer was no. And then there were other people who said, well, of course the way to handle the past is just to forgive and forget. And you can guess who they were. They were the bad guys. And they were only too pleased to suggest that we should just, you know, forget and move on. How dare anybody tell somebody whose child was tortured to death, forgive and forget? How dare you say to a family who were taken out of their family home and dumped in an inhospitable wasteland, forgive and forget? How dare you tell a whole generation of kids who just never got an education because of the colour of their skin, forgive and forget? And so some of us then ask the question, is it not possible to remember and forgive? And the truth and reconciliation process that grew out of that question. Can one remember and forgive? And I can't go into details about it, I haven't got the time, but I think that people's breath was taken away by the hearings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The motto of that commission was, without truth, no healing. Without forgiveness, no future. The truth, we needed to make space for the grace of forgiveness to operate if people could find that grace. You can't force people to forgive. Forgiveness is not something you can manufacture or organize. All you can do is make space for people to choose forgiveness if they should want to. And I remember just sitting in those hearings and shaking my head sometimes, staggered by the magnanimity of spirit which some amazing people showed. I remember a policeman. The police had set a trap for some young black activists, and these kids had fallen into the trap, and the police had captured them and then just walked around and put a shot into the back of each one of their heads as they lay on the ground and killed them. And now one of those policemen was standing before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and he had to tell his story and make this disclosure. And the mother of one of those kids was sitting, listening. A black woman of about, I suppose, 45. And after this massive admission and confession by this policeman, there's a long silence. And Desmond Tutu says, "Well, Mama, do you wish to say something?" And she said, "Yes, I do." She said, "I'm very angry. I'm very angry. But I'm also glad because now I know the truth. And I know that you are the one who shot my son." Now she said, "I have no son because of you. You are a young man." And she said, "You need to know that I'm a Christian. And because I'm a Christian, I forgive you. From now on, you are my son. I need you, and you need me." And one day when I arrived, the word went around that some very, very dangerous people had arrived, and they were in isolation. And only the chaplain, for a while, was got to see them. And this was Nelson Mandela and his amazing group of remarkable colleagues, some of the most graceful, intelligent, intellectually exciting, courageous, morally upright people that you could ever wish to meet. And we all know the story of Nelson Mandela, how he came out of prison after 27 years, and everybody says, "Oh my goodness, amazing. He came out and there he was forgiving people." I don't think it's amazing. I think every politician should go to jail for about 27 years before they run for president, and and you will see the difference. But let me just remind you of some of the things that Nelson Mandela taught us. And he grew up in a Methodist school and in a Methodist community. The first thing he learned, which seems to me to be such sense, is the permanency of the enemy. That when you're in conflict with somebody, something inside of you actually dreams, completely unrealistically, that they'll go away one day. They don't go away. They stay around. And so once you come to terms with the fact that these people who you are in conflict with are going to be around for the rest of your life, then you start thinking of other ways of dealing with them. And that's why early in prison, Mandela turned to his colleagues and said, "Chaps," I'm using his exact words, this comes from a Methodist school upbringing which has a kind of an English touch to it. "Chaps, we are going to be here a long time. Let's get to know these people, these white Afrikaner racist guards. Let's get to know them. Let's get inside their heads. Let's understand what makes them tick. Because one day we're going to deal with these people." That's just being very realistic. But it's amazing how many people are kind of blind to that reality. The second is always to recognize the dignity in the other. Those prisoners on Robben Island were treated with great brutality, and they certainly didn't take it lying down. They took every opportunity to protest it and to defy it, but always with grace and dignity and a refusal to belittle the other. And so I can remember being driven in a truck by one of these white Afrikaner racist guards, and him telling me, without me having to say a word, "These people are different, eh? They have dignity. Nothing we can do shakes them." There's Robert Sobukwe, he said. That was another great leader who was
imprisoned on the island. And he said every morning he's in solitary. Nobody ever is allowed to talk to him. And every morning he comes out dressed in a suit, as if he's ready for work. He says there's something about these people. And then, not just recognizing the dignity of the other, but making space for the other. One of the wonderful things about Mandela's approach to his enemies was that he always left them space to maneuver. He gave them space to move. What's the point in driving somebody into a corner so that they just lash out? And so there was always this opportunity, always handing the other the opportunity to be different, almost as if I'm expecting you to be different. I'm going to treat you as if you are different, and maybe you will be. And then an insight into how people change. Mandela is one of the people who learned, I guess, from the Christian gospel, that fear may change people's behavior, but only forgiveness and grace change who people really are. And he realized very early on in the piece that it was the deep change inside of people that really mattered. And I have evidence of the other side of that, because I found myself here in America on with a group of people, including the man who used to offer me accommodation from time to time. He was the Minister of Justice in South Africa in the apartheid regime, and he put me up on more than one occasion in the state accommodations of South Africa's prisons. And we found ourselves on the same platform, and I wondered what he would say. And I spoke first, and I did thank him for the free accommodation he had given me in the past. And he got up and he started speaking about the change in our country. And he said, you know, lots of things had to change, but I discovered that the deepest change had to reach deep down inside of myself to where I really live. And something had to change there. Now, this was a Minister of Justice who had supervised our prison system, whose minions had tortured many people, confessing essentially that he had to be converted for change to come. So I shared just some of these lessons which have come to us through the gracious gift of suffering in our country and in our continent, and invite you now to ask any questions you have. We have a